I feel like we've covered enough topics where we're actually ready to deploy our Hot Chocolate GraphQL server. So I'm going to preface by saying that this is not going to be the final tutorial. We're not just going to deploy and be done. I still want to cover other things like actually finishing our application, porting to .NET 6, and also getting into file uploads with GraphQL as well. I feel like that could be interesting and could actually fit into our domain that we're dealing with. So for deployment, I am going to deploy to Azure, and there's a few things we're going to have to do. So we're going to have to deploy our actual Hot Chocolate GraphQL server to Azure App Service. That's where we're going to host this. There's other options on Azure, but I feel like this is going to be the simplest, and we might actually be able to do it for free as well. And then the other thing we're going to have to deploy is a database, because right now we're using a SQLite file database, and that is just not going to work well in the cloud, because if we have multiple instances of our application running in the cloud, then they're each going to have their own databases, and that is just a mess. I don't even want to think about that. And then I'm not even sure. I feel like Azure App Service, they might not even allow you to write to the file system, which wouldn't work for a SQLite database because it's a database file. I know some cloud providers are like that. I'm not sure if Azure App Service is, but that's another problem that we might face. And then finally, if we were to restart the app or redeploy the app, we'd risk losing our database file as well. So overall, not going to be using SQLite, and that's exactly where we're going to start this deployment. So no more SQLite, we're going to have to port to a different option, and I'm going to go with SQL Server. So unfortunately, right now, all of our database migrations for Entity Framework are for SQLite. So these migrations are not going to work on a SQL Server database. So there is a way with Entity Framework where you can support migrations for multiple different database providers, and I'll have a link to that in the description, but I feel like that's going to be kind of complicated to implement and might not really be worth our time to do here. So what I'm going to do instead is just port our local environment to use SQL Server as well. So no more SQLite, we are going to use SQL Server. And to do this, we are going to need a NuGet package. So let's go manage our NuGet packages, and let's search for, I think we can just search for SQL Server, and we want Microsoft.entityframeworkcore.SQL Server. This is 6.0.2. I'm not on .NET 6 yet, so I'm going to do, I think 5.0.9 is what I want, because I am using Entity Framework Core 5.0.9. So let's do that. And now back in our startup.cs, we can use SQL Server and pass in our connection string. But right now, our connection string is still our SQLite database, and quite frankly, we don't even have a SQL Server database running locally yet. But I do have SQL Server running locally. So if we go into this View tab and select SQL Server Object Explorer, I have LocalDB running. I believe you can install LocalDB from the Visual Studio installation wizard, so be sure to check that out if you don't have this. But if I open this up, we have databases in here, and I have a bunch of like old stale databases in here, but we're going to create a new database. So let's add a new database. I'm just going to call this GraphQL-demo. So let's create that. And then if I right click this and go to properties, we get this properties tab over here. And right here, we actually get a connection string. So I'm going to copy this value and just paste that as my connection string right here in my app settings.json. And this connection string is going to be for local development. In production, we're going to be hitting an Azure SQL Server. So I'm going to actually move this to my app settings.development.json just to be safe, so we don't get any conflicts, which I don't think we would, but just so that we know that this is the development database. So it should be good there. So we're going to have a SQL Server database for development and production. And that means that we can get rid of these old migrations, because these are for SQLite, and we're done with SQLite. So let's delete that, and we're going to have to create new migrations. So now if we open our GraphQL demo API in a terminal, we can generate new migrations by doing .NET ef migrations add, and we'll just call this migration initial and run this. And I actually get this error for the Google application credentials missing. And the reason for that is because we use Google application default credentials to create this Firebase app, which we eventually use for Firebase authentication. So if you're not using Firebase authentication, this probably isn't an issue, but we get this environment variable from our launch settings.json when we run in development. So when we run migrations, this environment variable isn't there. So what I'm going to do instead real quick is just not use Google application default credentials and manually specify our credentials. So we can do that when we create our Firebase app, if we open this up, we can pass in app options. So let's create one of those, and we want to specify a credential. And for that, we can use Google credential, and I want to load my credentials from a file, and that file path that we want to pass into this method, so it takes in a file path, is going to be my Firebase config.json over here. So I'm just going to get this path from an app settings value. So I think for app settings.development.json, we can just specify Firebase config path, and this is just going to be /Firebase config.json. So let's get this value out of our configuration and pass it into our Google credential. So we can take our configuration and we want to get a value. This value is a string, and the key is what we just added. So Firebase config path. So let's copy that and use that. And we can clean up our launch settings.json as well. So get rid of that environment variable because we no longer need it. So all good there. Let's try running these migrations again. Let's stay on track. And there we go. We got our migrations. And here we go. Initial, we create all of our tables. So now if we just run our application, we should see our database get new tables generated, which I assume we did because we did connect to our database and we didn't get startup errors. So that's good. So let's go look at our database. So GraphQL demo, look at that tables, and there we go. We got courses, instructors, and students. So all good there. We have successfully moved over to SQL Server. So now we can connect to an Azure SQL Server. So let's head over to Azure. All right, so this is the very beginning of our Azure adventures for this application. So I'm going to start by creating a new resource group for all of our application's resources. So let's create that. I'm going to call mine GraphQL demo, and we can create this. There we go. And the first thing we're going to add to our resource group, of course, is our SQL Server database. So let's go up to this tab and let's go to SQL databases. Should be, I guess this is my favorites. I'll show how to get to it. So I'll go to all services first, and then over here we can select databases, and we want SQL databases. So let's create a SQL database. And first off, let's select our resource group. So GraphQL demo. Our database name can be GraphQL demo DB. And then we're going to have to create a SQL server to host this database. So let's create a new SQL server. I guess we could have done this first, but it's nice that the create database wizard lets us just do it here. So for our server name, we can just call this GraphQL demo server. And then I'm going to use SQL authentication here. I'll make my login singleton Sean. My password can just be test123 ! And put that into confirm password as well. And let's go ahead and create this. So all good here. We're not going to use SQL Elastic Pool. We're going to keep it simple. But I do want to configure this compute and storage. This is pretty important. So let's look at this. So the default option they give us is this general purpose provision database. And that's just about $400 a month. So that's perfect for us. Just kidding. We're going to go with the cheaper option. So we could go serverless, where you pretty much just pay for what you use. And in this case, it's estimated at about $5 per month. That's pretty nice. And then we can also change our service tier to be DTU based. So if we select this, this is database transaction units. And I'm not really an expert on this, but in this model, you pretty much pay for compute power, reads, writes, stuff like that. And for this, it's estimated at just $5 a month as well. So I'm just going to go with this and apply that. So let's move on to networking. So for accessing our database, we're just going to go with a public endpoint for now. And I am going to allow Azure services to access this server, which is going to be useful because we're going to be deploying our server to Azure, so that'll be nice. And then I want to hit this database locally before I deploy, so I am going to add my current IP address to the firewall. So let's add that, and let's move on to security. I'm not really going to add any of these add-ons. Let's move on again. We're going to start with a blank database, so we should be able to move on to create our database. So let's create that. This might take a while, so let's just let this run. All right, sweet. So I just got back from the bathroom, and it finished. So let's go to our database, go to resource, and I want to connect to this database. So let's go over here in this tab to settings and connection strings, and let's just copy this ADO.NET connection string. So copy that to the clipboard, and now back in Visual Studio with our project, let's go into appsettings.development.json, and let me comment out this other database connection string for now, and let's add another one. We'll call this default, so we can just reference it from our app right away and paste in the connection string. But as you can see, we're going to have to specify our password to log into our SQL Server. So let's add that here. I made mine test 123 exclamation point. And I'm just sharing my user ID and password because I'm going to delete this database when I'm done with it. But these are not credentials you want to just be giving out. So keep this sensitive. Don't check this in the source control either, which we're not going to do. But this is just for testing purposes. So we got our database. Let's run this. And we should actually run migrations against that database. Let's see. Oh, looks like the connection was good. I think I saw some logs. So yeah, we connected. We created our databases. So if we go back into Azure and then we can go to this query editor, let me put in my credentials right here. Then as we can see over here in these tables, we have courses, instructors, and students. So there we go, we successfully connected to our database. So one thing I want to do real quick is just insert an instructor and a course and make sure we can get those back from our query. So we're going to insert into instructors the values and then put those in here. So if we look at instructors, we need an ID, first name, last name, and salary. So I'm going to have to generate a GUID. So I'm going to use GUIDgenerator.com. So let's generate one, copy that, paste that in here. And then we need first name. So I'll be Singleton. And then my last name will be Sean. That makes a lot of sense. And then my salary will be $1. So let's run that, insert that instructor, and then I'll insert a course real quick as well. Let me add a new query. So insert into courses and then add our values. I'm just going to paste the same GUID and then change the last letter. And then the course name will be GraphQL 101. The subject, this is an enum, so it's mapped as an integer. I'm going to go with 1. I don't recall what that maps to. The creator ID, so this is going to be the Firebase user ID. And I do not have one of those, but this is nullable, so I'm just going to null it right now. And then instructor ID is the ID for the instructor we just created. So let's run this, and there we go. That works. So let's go back into Banana Cake Pop, and let me add a new query here. We're still just hitting our local GraphQL server because that's all we have. But I'm going to query for courses, and let's dig into nodes. Let's grab the course ID, the course name. Let's see what the subject was. And then let's grab the instructor ID, first name, last name, and salary. So let's run this, and we should get our data back from our production database. So that's good. And the subject is science. That makes sense because this is computer science. But there we go. We've knocked out step 1 of just connecting to our production database. So now we just need to deploy our Hot Chocolate server, and then we can connect that server to our production database, and we should be good to go. So let's bring back our development database before we forget to do that, and get rid of our production database in our app settings.development.json. And now let's head back into Azure. So I did mention I want to deploy our Hot Chocolate server to Azure App Service. So let's go back to services. We can just leave these queries. We don't need those anymore. And let's see where we can find Azure App Service. I think if we go to web, here we go, app services, and let's create an app service. So I'm going to put this in our GraphQL demo resource group. I'm going to call our app GraphQL demo API. I'm just going to publish this from code. I think in the future in this series, I do want to publish a Docker container as well. But for now, I'm just going to keep this simple. So for a runtime stack, obviously we're on .NET, specifically .NET 5. I'm going to keep this on Windows because I did all my development on Windows. So might as well just keep it the same. We can leave the region and then we can select a plan. So I'm going to create a new plan. I'll call it GraphQL demo plan. So let's add that. And then I'm going to change this plan. So many options here. I think just for a demo, I don't really need to use these production options because they're kind of expensive. So if we move over to dev/test, we can actually just use the free plan. So that's just 60 minutes per day of compute. You get 1 GB of memory, but it is free. I feel like that's all we need for this because I don't think many people are going to be hitting my GraphQL server, sadly. But let's do that, and we should be good here. So let's move on. I'm not going to set up a GitHub Actions pipeline. Maybe in the future of the series, I will set up continuous deployment. But let's move on to monitoring. I am going to add application insights. Why not? So now we can move on to create this. So let's create. This might take a while, so prepare to wait. Alrighty, so app service created. So let's go to this resource and we can see it is running. So we click this URL. There we go. Yay, except we need our app up here. So now we just got to deploy to this app service. So I'm going to grab this publish profile. So let's click get publish profile. So now with this publish profile, if we go back into Visual Studio, and then right click on our project and click publish. What I want to do is import a profile. So let's do that. and let's browse to that file we just downloaded. So there we go, should be a .publish settings file. So let's do that. And right here we have our published profile. So this is GraphQL demo API web deploy. And if we go over to properties, published profiles, we have actually 3 published profiles. So one for web deploy, zip deploy, and FTP. So for this, we're just going to use web deploy. And then since we have a service dependency on SQL Server, which is true based on what we did in the beginning, and we can configure this dependency and actually point to our Azure SQL Database right here. But I'm not going to get into this. I feel like it's unnecessary, and we can just do all of that from the Azure portal. So let's not do this. Let's just ignore this for all of our profiles. So now let's go ahead and publish using our web deploy profile. There we go. And then here we go. Our web app was published successfully. So now let's see if our app is running. So we can click this right here. This is the link to our app service, and our app failed to start. And honestly, this was kind of expected because we haven't set our connection string. So let's do that. So if we go to settings, configuration in app service, and then come on down to connection strings, let's add a new connection string. Ours is called default. That's what we reference in our startup.cs. The type is SQL Server. And now we just need our connection string value. So let me grab that. I'm going to open this in a new tab, and let's go to SQL databases and select our GraphQL demo DB. Go to connection strings and copy this, and then head back to our connection strings and paste this in for default. Let's change our password to, again, test123 exclamation point, and let's save this. And then all we have to do is save our configuration. So let's do that. And that should automatically restart our app. So if I refresh, and let's see if our app starts this time, and it looks like we get the 500 again. The app did fail to start, and I believe it's because if we go to app settings.development.json, we specified our Firebase config path right here, but this is for development, so this isn't going to be applied for production. And if we don't have this, then we're not going to be able to load our Google credential, and our startup is probably going to fail, which I think is what's happening. So we could move this Firebase config path to our app settings.json. But in the future, I have plans where I actually don't want to use the Firebase config.json as our credential. And then if we added this to app settings.json, we'd have to redeploy. So what we can do instead is I'm going to copy this key. So we want the Firebase config path to be set in production. And if I go into app service settings configuration, I can just specify that value as an application setting. So let's add that. This is the Firebase config path, and I want that to be Firebase-config.json. So let's add that, and let's save, and that should restart our app, and hopefully this will work. So I'm going to refresh, and let's see what happens. Oh, that's actually a good sign. So we got a 404 instead of a 500. That's a path in the right direction. And that makes sense because we're not actually serving anything at our base URL. We are serving our GraphQL server at /GraphQL. So let's do that. And yeah, there we go. Now we're in Banana Cake Pop. So let's create a document, and we are hitting our production GraphQL server. And let's just do a query for courses. Let's get all the courses. We'll grab the name, subject, and then for the instructor, we'll grab the first name and last name. And we should get one course back with an instructor, which we manually added to the database earlier. So let's try that. And here we go. We get our course back against our production database using our production Hot Chocolate server. So we have successfully deployed to production. First thing we did was port our local database to use SQL Server instead of SQLite. And that was useful so that we didn't have to manage two sets of Entity Framework migrations, one for SQLite and one for SQL Server. Now everything just uses SQL Server migrations. And then after that, we created an Azure SQL Database, which we connected to locally eventually so that we could test that the connection did work. And then finally, we created an Azure App Service to host our Hot Chocolate GraphQL server. And finally, we deployed using publish profiles. So hopefully you can use this to deploy your own Hot Chocolate GraphQL server to production. If you have any questions, criticisms, or concerns, be sure to leave them below in the comments section. If you enjoyed the video or are enjoying the channel, consider becoming a member. Other than that, leave a like or subscribe for more. Thank you.